Minnesota. 10,000 lakes. Forests so thick the GPS stops working. Towns so quiet the neighbors all wave. Somewhere in all that quiet, 10 people vanished and nobody knows where they went. 10 disappearances. 10 places you could drive to today. Pull up a map, lock your doors. Let's get into it. If you're new here, subscribe. New cases every week. The first case starts on a spring night in 2008, in the flat farmland of southwest Minnesota, where the roads don't have names and the cell towers are miles apart. A 19-year-old kid called his parents just after midnight. He'd driven into a ditch. He wasn't hurt. He just needed a ride home. It was the last call anyone would ever get from Brandon Swanson. Brandon Victor Swanson was born January 30, 1989, in Marshall, Minnesota, a quiet town of about 14,000 people in Lyon County. He was a science kid, curious, responsible, the kind of son who called home. He'd spent the past year studying wind turbine technology at Minnesota West Community and Technical College's campus in Canby, about 35 miles from Marshall. He was done after this semester. That fall, he was supposed to transfer to Iowa Western College, a big step, a real future. He was excited about it. His family was excited about it. There was nothing about Brandon Swanson that suggested a man planning to disappear. There's one detail about Brandon that matters here, and it matters a lot. He was legally blind in his left eye. He wore black wire-framed glasses, prescription, not fashion. Without them, he couldn't see well enough to navigate. He left those glasses in his car that night. May 13, 2008, was the last day of classes at Minnesota West. Brandon celebrated with friends, first at a gathering in Lind, then at a friend's house in Canby. He had a few drinks through the evening. His friends said he didn't seem dangerously drunk. Around midnight, he got in his Chevrolet Lumina and started the 30-minute drive home to Marshall. Instead of taking Highway 68, the most direct route, he took back roads, gravel county roads, the kind that run between fields with no signs and no lights for miles. This is where it stops being a normal night. Somewhere on those back roads, Brandon drove into a ditch. The car's wheels couldn't get enough traction to pull out. He was stuck, in the dark, on an unmarked road in southwest Minnesota. He called his parents. He told them he thought he was near Lind, a small town about 7 miles southwest of Marshall. His parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, got in their truck immediately and headed toward Lind. They kept him on the phone. Brandon stayed at the car at first, flashing his headlights, trying to signal. His parents drove and flashed their headlights back. He couldn't see them. They couldn't see him. They were both in the dark, talking to each other, and they might as well have been in different counties, because, as it turned out, they were. Here's the critical detail, and this is the thing that makes this case so hard to get your head around. When investigators later pulled Brandon's cell phone records, the data from the tower his phone pinged told a completely different story than what he'd told his parents. Brandon wasn't near Lind. He was near Porter and Taunton in Lincoln County, 25 miles away. Somehow, on back roads he drove nearly every day. Brandon had gotten so turned around that he was a full 25 miles from where he believed he was, and there's no road route between those two locations that matches the path he described walking. Nobody knows how that happened. Brandon gave up waiting at the car. He told his father to head to the parking lot of a local bar and wait. He said he could see lights in the distance that he believed were a town, probably Lind, he thought. He was going to walk toward them. He started moving through fields and farmland in the dark, legally blind without his glasses, at somewhere around 2 in the morning on a cold May night in rural Minnesota. He kept his father on the phone. Brian Swanson drove toward the bar and waited, talking to his son, while Brandon walked across the flat darkness of southwest Minnesota toward lights that may not have been where he thought they were. They stayed on the phone for 47 minutes. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, mid-sentence, Brandon said 2 words, "Oh, shit." Then the line went silent. Brian called back immediately. Brandon didn't answer. Annette called. No answer. They called again. Silence. They drove back toward the roads he'd described, calling his name out the truck windows. Nothing. They searched through the rest of the night. When morning came with no sign of their son, they called the police. And here's where the first institutional failure enters this case. The responding officers told the Swansons to wait. Brandon was 19 years old. He'd been drinking. It was not unusual for young men his age to turn up after a night out. They were advised to go home. No search was launched that morning. No urgency. No immediate mobilization of resources. By the time investigators began treating this as a genuine missing person emergency, hours had passed. Hours in which the trail, if there was one, had already begun to go cold. When law enforcement finally used the cell phone tower data to locate Brandon's car, they found it near Porter, in Lincoln County, 25 miles from Lind. The car was in the ditch. The doors were open. The keys were missing. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no blood, no indication of what happened. His glasses were still on the seat, and Brandon Swanson was nowhere. The search that followed would become one of the largest missing person operations in Minnesota history. Cadaver dogs were deployed immediately. They followed a scent trail from the car toward the Yellow Medicine River, a waterway that runs through the area, which was running high and fast in May due to spring snowmelt. The banks are steep in places. The drop into the water is difficult to see at night, especially without eyeglasses, especially in the dark. The dogs followed the scent to the riverbank. Then the trail ended, just ended. Investigators focused heavily on the river. Dive teams went in. The water was searched. It was searched again. Years later, in 2021, a drought reduced the Yellow Medicine River to nearly nothing. Investigators walked the dry bed. They found no trace of Brandon Swanson. And that's the last confirmed information anyone has about where Brandon went after 2:30 in the morning on May 14, 2008. 122 square miles of southwest Minnesota farmland would eventually be searched over years, across multiple agencies, through multiple seasons. Dogs kept following scent trails into a northwest area beyond Whiskey Jack Lake that had never been fully covered. Some farmers refused to allow search dogs onto their land during planting and harvesting season, which meant there were permanent geographic gaps in the search area that no one could legally close. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension took over as lead agency in 2010. The case is still open. There's a detail about Brandon's phone that doesn't get talked about enough. After he went silent on the call at 2:30 in the morning, his phone remained active and powered on until May 16th, 2 full days after he disappeared. Someone, or something, had access to that phone for 48 hours after the last call. It was never recovered. The porch light at the Swanson house stayed on every single night for 5 years. Brian and Annette left it burning, just in case. One direct consequence of the police delay in this case was a piece of legislation. In 2009, 1 year after Brandon disappeared, the Minnesota legislature passed what became known as Brandon's Law, a law requiring police to immediately take a missing persons report and launch an investigation for any person, regardless of age, reported missing under dangerous circumstances. No more waiting. No more assuming a 19-year-old drinking on a Saturday night would just show up. The law has since been adopted in other states. It didn't help the Swansons find their son, but it was the thing they could do. Brandon's case ended with a voice going silent in the dark of a Minnesota field, 25 miles from where anyone was looking. The next case begins on a college campus, and the trail ends even faster. Here's what doesn't make sense about the Brandon Swanson case, and there are several things, but this one is the hardest to dismiss. The cell phone data placed him near Porter. His parents were near Lind. 25 miles is not a short distance on foot, but it's also not an impossible one to cover by car, on a back road. The question investigators have never been able to answer isn't just where Brandon was, it's how he got there. The route he would have had to take from Canby to end up near Porter instead of near Lind involves gravel roads that branch in ways that don't match the path he described. He was on the phone describing his surroundings. His descriptions didn't match Porter. They matched Lind. Somewhere between where he was driving and where the phone says he ended up, something happened to his sense of direction that 20 years of living in that county couldn't correct. One theory investigators have considered is that he accidentally fell into the Yellow Medicine River and drowned. His body swept downstream past the search area. The river was high. The banks are steep. A person stumbling through dark farmland at 2 in the morning without their glasses could, in theory, walk straight off a riverbank without seeing the drop coming. The cadaver dogs went to that riverbank. They lost the trail there. The problem with this theory is that bodies in rivers surface. They get caught in bends. They wash up on banks. The Yellow Medicine River was searched exhaustively, including in 2021, when the drought left it virtually dry. Nothing. Not a bone, not a shoe, not a phone. If Brandon Swanson fell into that river, it kept him in a way that rivers almost never keep a person. A second theory is that he stumbled into Mud Creek or another drainage feature in the area, with the same hypothetical outcome. A third theory, one that investigators have not ruled out, is foul play. Someone out there on rural roads at 2 in the morning who saw his headlights, who approached. Rural southwest Minnesota is not a violent place, but darkness and isolation and a young man walking blind through fields is the kind of combination that doesn't require a criminal mastermind. It just requires one wrong encounter. No one knows what caused him to say, "Oh shit." That's the detail that pulls at everyone who follows this case. Those 2 words are the entire evidence of whatever happened. Something surprised him. Something alarmed him. And then the phone went dead, and Brandon Swanson has not been seen or heard from since. His glasses were still in the car. St. John's University sits on 2,500 acres of pine forest and lake country in Collegeville, Minnesota, a small township in Stearns County, about an hour northwest of the Twin Cities. Students call it behind the pine curtain. It's the kind of campus that feels removed from the world by design: ancient trees, stone buildings, a Benedictine monastery on the grounds, 3 interconnected lakes that sit quiet under the Minnesota sky. In November of 2002, it had no security cameras, no campus-wide cell service, and a 3-minute walking path between 2 dormitories that a 20-year-old honor student walked down one night and never completed. Joshua Cheney Guimond was born June 18, 1982, in Redwood Falls, Minnesota, and grew up in Maple Lake. He graduated from Maple Lake High School in 2000 as both valedictorian and class president, the kind of student who didn't just excel academically, but wanted to be seen doing it in the best possible sense. He wanted to run for Congress someday. He told people that plainly, without embarrassment. He debated on the Pre-Law Society, competed on the mock trial team, played baritone in the wind ensemble. He was a junior at St. John's, studying political science, and by all accounts, he was exactly on track. There's one detail about Josh that matters that night, similar to Brandon Swanson in a way that feels almost uncanny. Josh had poor vision. He wore glasses. On the night of November 9th, 2002, he left his glasses in his dorm room. He also left his coat, even though November in central Minnesota runs cold. He left without his car keys. He left without his credit cards. He left, as far as anyone could tell, with nothing, as though he was only going a few steps. On the evening of November 9th, Josh had been writing a paper in his room at St. Moore House. Just before 11, he walked north across campus with friends to a card party in an apartment at Metten Court, another dormitory. The walk took a few minutes. The party was small, 8 to 10 students, playing poker. Josh had somewhere between 7 and 12 beers over the course of the evening, but the people there said he didn't seem drunk in any alarming way. He was in a good mood the whole walk over, a friend later said. He was himself. At approximately 11:45 in the evening, Josh got up and left the apartment. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't announce he was leaving. He just got up mid-party and walked out. Some people at the party assumed he'd gone to use the bathroom. Others assumed he'd just decided to head back to his room, a 3-minute walk south, back to St. Moore House. No one followed him out. No one thought anything was wrong. He was a 20-year-old on a familiar campus who'd had some beers and was heading home. He never got there. The walk from Metten Court to St. Moore House crosses a bridge near Stumpf Lake, a body of water that sits between the 2 dormitories. It's not a long crossing. 2 witnesses would later report seeing someone matching Josh's description on or near that bridge, sometime between 12:15 and 12:30 in the morning, roughly 30 minutes after he left the party. Those sightings were unconfirmed and disputed. What isn't disputed is that after 11:45 on the night of November 9th, Joshua Guimond was never seen again. His friends didn't realize anything was wrong that night. They assumed he'd gone to bed. The following evening, Josh missed a mock trial team event. That was completely out of character. He never missed anything. When his roommates couldn't reach him and realized his bed hadn't been slept in, they reported him missing. By then, more than 18 hours had passed since anyone had seen him. Now this is where the case turns dark, and it happens fast. Stearns County Sheriff's deputies responded and launched a search. Bloodhounds were brought in and given Josh's scent from clothing in his room. The dog followed the trail from Metten Court south toward St. Tay, Morehouse toward home, and then onto the bridge near Stumpf Lake. There, the trail stopped. The dog showed strong interest in the bridge and the water's edge. The sheriff's office immediately focused their investigation on the theory that Josh had fallen or been pushed into Stumpf Lake, possibly while intoxicated, and drowned. Here's the critical detail that would haunt this case for the next 20 years. That theory was almost certainly wrong, and valuable time was lost chasing it. The lake was searched. Stumpf Lake was searched with dive teams, with sonar, with underwater cameras. A second and third lake on campus, Gemini Lake, and a lake behind the monastery were also searched. Bloodhounds were brought in multiple times over the following weeks and months. Josh's family, frustrated by the pace of the official investigation, had to personally request that the elite Trident dive team be brought in twice to conduct a thorough, professional underwater search of every body of water on campus. Those searches found nothing. In 2023, 21 years after Josh disappeared, the Stearns County Sheriff's Office officially stated that the drowning theory could be put to rest. The lake had nothing to do with it. But here's what doesn't make sense. While the official search was focused on the water, a second, privately arranged bloodhound named Hoover, brought in by Josh's family, and the family of another missing student in December of 2002, told a different story entirely. Hoover started from Metten Court, followed Josh's scent past Stumpf Lake, and tracked it into the back section of St. John's Abbey. The same dog also detected the scent of Chris Jenkins, a University of Minnesota student who had gone missing on Halloween of the same year, a man with no known connection to St. John's University whatsoever. Investigators followed up on the Abbey lead. They were denied access to search certain areas of the Abbey on December 31, 2002. The search of the Abbey and its buildings was, by the family's account, never fully completed in those early critical weeks. This matters for a reason that's impossible to separate from the timeline. On October 2002, 1 month before Josh disappeared, St. John's Abbey had publicly announced a settlement in over a dozen lawsuits involving sexual abuse by monks. The cases dated back decades. The scandal was still fresh, still unresolved in the community, still generating news. And Josh Guimond, the political science student who wanted to become a congressman, had apparently been writing a paper on the university's institutional response to that scandal in the days before he vanished. Whether that's a coincidence is officially unknown. The investigation that followed uncovered other things about Josh that weren't publicly known. Investigators found that he had been active on online chat platforms, using multiple accounts, and that in 2 of those accounts, he had presented himself as a woman when messaging men. 20 years after his disappearance, in 2022, the Stearns County Sheriff's Office publicly released photographs found on Josh's computer and asked the public to help identify the men in them. The Sheriff's Office believed 1 or more of those individuals might have relevant information about where Josh went that night, that he may have arranged to meet someone, and that whoever that someone was had never come forward. And then there is the detail that no one has ever explained satisfactorily. Several days after Josh disappeared, data was wiped from his computer. Not by Josh, by someone who had access to his computer after he was already gone. Who did that, and what they erased, remains officially unknown to this day. There was also a man never identified and never charged seen on campus the night Josh disappeared, driving an orange Pontiac Sunfire. Witnesses placed him in multiple locations around campus known for hookups, dropping off other men. Police eventually tracked the driver down. He denied any involvement. Before investigators could properly search the car, he had it destroyed. There is no law against destroying your own property, even if the timing is striking. The Sunfire was never examined. A National Guard search of the campus on November 13, 2002 found nothing. The search widened to surrounding woods and farmland. Cadaver dogs were used repeatedly over the following months. Helicopter searches were conducted. Nothing. No physical evidence, no blood, no clothing, no body, no sign of a struggle anywhere. In 2022, Netflix's Unsolved Mysteries dedicated an episode to Josh's disappearance, and tips came in from around the country. Investigators reviewed them. The case is still open. The Stearns County Sheriff's Office, the same agency that had been criticized for its handling of earlier high-profile cases in the same county, took the position that there was no hard evidence pointing to any specific suspect or cause. Brian Guimond, Josh's father, has spent more than 2 decades publicly and bluntly expressing his frustration with that assessment, and with the years his investigators spent looking at a lake that had nothing to do with his son's disappearance. Here's what the case leaves you with. A 3-minute walk on a familiar campus. No coat, no glasses, no belongings, packed nothing that suggests someone planning to go anywhere. A scent trail that went toward the Abbey, not the lake. A computer wiped clean by a person who has never been identified. A car destroyed before it could be searched. And somewhere in the woods and lakes of a campus described as behind the pine curtain, a 20-year-old who wanted to be a congressman simply ceased to exist. His dad, Brian Guimond, is still waiting for answers. On a Stearns County campus, Josh walked into the dark between 2 buildings and disappeared. The next case, a teenage girl stops 1 mile from home and someone was waiting. There is a layer to the Josh Guimond case that sits underneath all the other details, and it's the one his father has returned to again and again in interviews over the past 2 decades. The Stearns County Sheriff's Office was the same agency that handled the investigation into the 1989 abduction of Jacob Wetterling, another case from the same county, another case that would take decades to resolve, another case where the early investigative decisions have since been widely criticized. And it was the same agency that, years later, would be involved in the cold case investigation of the Reeker sisters, who disappeared from St. Cloud in 1974. This is the same county, the same institutional body, across 3 of the most significant unsolved cases in Minnesota history. Whether that pattern reflects something systemic or is simply the cruel geography of unsolved crime clustering in a region is something no official body has ever formally addressed. What remains is this. Josh left a party that was 30 seconds away from becoming unremarkable. He walked into the night with nothing on his back and nothing in his pockets in November, without his glasses, 3 minutes from his bed, and somewhere between those 2 buildings, on a campus surrounded by 2,500 acres of pine forest and cold Minnesota lakes, he was gone. No body, no blood, no phone call, no confirmed sighting, no explanation. Just the computer, wiped clean, and the orange Pontiac, destroyed. And a trail that led toward the Abbey and then stopped. January in Minnesota is not a gentle thing. By the 3rd week of the month, the cold has been sitting on the ground for weeks. And when a storm comes through, it doesn't arrive. Gradually, it arrives like a decision. On the evening of January 19th, 1988, a blizzard swept across Washington County, east of St. Paul. Visibility dropped, the roads iced. Sensible people stayed where they were. Susan Sweedell was 1 mile from home, and someone was waiting for her. Susan Ann Sweedell was 19 years old, and she worked 2 jobs. In the mornings, she worked at a store called Body and Soul at the St. Croix Mall in Oak Park Heights. In the afternoons and evenings, she worked at the Kmart in the same shopping complex. She'd graduated from Stillwater High School, spent 2 semesters at the University of Wisconsin at River Falls, and decided she wasn't ready to be that far from home, so she came back to Lake Elmo, where she lived with her mother Kathy and her younger sister Christine. Her family described her as warm, sociable, and by her own admission, naive. She trusted people. She was easy to talk to. She liked being liked. In the weeks before she disappeared, Susan had been using telephone chat lines to meet people. It was 1988. This was how a certain kind of social life happened. before the internet, before smartphones. You called a number. You talked to strangers. You sometimes made plans. Susan had also been receiving calls at work from a man she referred to as Dale. Who Dale was, whether he was someone she'd met on a chat line, someone she knew from her daily life, or someone else entirely, has never been established. His identity remains officially unknown. Whether he had anything to do with what happened to her that night is unknown, but the calls at work were noted, and they were regular. On the morning of January 19th, Susan had breakfast with her sister and left for work around 8:45. She worked her shift at Body and Soul, then her afternoon shift at Kmart. At approximately 9 in the evening, she called her mother from work. The blizzard was picking up outside. Susan said she was nervous to drive in it. Her mother told her to take her time, stay on the main roads, and come home when she felt safe. It was a routine conversation, the kind mothers and daughters have. Before Susan left work, she changed her clothes. She'd been wearing a red pantsuit through her shift. She changed out of it into a short skirt. Her family would later note that this was strange. Changing into a short skirt to drive home in a blizzard didn't make sense if you were just going home. It was the kind of detail that suggested Susan might have been planning to see someone, or might have been asked to look a certain way by someone she was planning to meet, or it might have been something else entirely. The reason she changed has never been explained. She got in her car, a maroon 1975 Oldsmobile Cutlass, and started the drive home. Lake Elmo was about a mile from where she worked, maybe less. She drove it every day. She knew the route. But that night, somewhere on the way, the car started overheating. She pulled into a gas station at the corner of Manning Avenue North and Highway 5, right on the outskirts of Lake Elmo, approximately 1 mile from her home. She asked the attendant if she could leave the car there because she was having car trouble. He told her she needed to move it because the snowplow would be coming through. She complied and moved the car, and then stood outside the station in the blizzard, 1 mile from her front door. This is where it stops being a normal night. A man was there. He was described by witnesses as tall, well-built, with shoulder-length curly, sandy brown hair, unshaven, wearing a leather jacket. He appeared to have been waiting near the station, not using it, just there. He and Susan talked. Then Susan got in his car, a late-model Ford LTD, and they drove away. That was the last time anyone confirmed seeing Susan Sweetle alive. The gas station attendant was the last person to see her. He watched her get in the car and watched the car pull out of the lot and into the snow. Her car and her purse were found at the gas station the next morning. Her driver's license was still in her purse. Her glasses were still inside the car. She had left behind everything that tied her to herself, her identity, her prescription, the things that meant she intended to come back. Her mother, Kathy, picked up the car the following day and took it home. And here's the critical detail that didn't surface until days later. 5 days after Susan disappeared, her mother drove the car to a grocery store in Stillwater. Halfway there, the car started smoking and steaming. She had it towed to a mechanic. The mechanic looked at the radiator and found the petcock, a small drain plug at the bottom of the radiator, had been loosened. Not broken, not worn. Loosened deliberately, in a way that would cause the coolant to slowly drain out, causing the car to overheat after a period of driving. The mechanic said someone would have had to tamper with it. The timing was the thing. If someone had loosened that petcock before Susan left work, the car would have overheated exactly when it did 1 mile from home, at a gas station, late at night, in a blizzard. The implication is almost too deliberate to absorb. If the petcock was tampered with intentionally, then whoever did it knew Susan's car, knew her schedule, and planned to be at that gas station when she stopped. The car trouble wasn't bad luck. It was the plan. Now this is where the case turns dark, because the strangeness doesn't end at the gas station. About a week after Susan disappeared, her mother and sister came home to their apartment and found something wrong. The spare key to the back door had been moved. It was in a different spot than it should have been. Inside, there were dirty dishes in the sink that hadn't been there when they left. There was an unusual sweet smell throughout the apartment. And when they checked Susan's bedroom, they found the red pantsuit she'd been wearing at work on January 19th, the one she'd changed out of before leaving balled up under her bed. It hadn't been there before she disappeared. Someone had been in the apartment. Whether that was Susan, returning briefly and then leaving again without a trace, or someone else entirely, it has never been determined. Susan's mother believed her daughter had come home, that she'd been inside that apartment. But Susan had left her glasses in the car, her purse at the gas station, her driver's license with it. If she came home with nothing, and left again with nothing, and has not been seen since. If it wasn't Susan, then whoever was in that apartment knew where she lived, had access to the spare key, and left her clothes under her bed. No arrest has ever been made in the disappearance of Susan Swedell. The man described at the gas station, tall, sandy brown hair, leather jacket, late 70s, Ford, was never identified. A suspect sketch was circulated. No match was made. The mysterious caller at Kmart, who Susan called Dale, was never traced. In 2006, investigators detected activity on Susan's social security number and confirmed it was a case of identity theft, not Susan. She was not alive somewhere under a different name. The lead went nowhere. Hit subscribe if you want to go deeper on cases like this. The Washington County Sheriff's Office has kept this case active for nearly 4 decades. A reward of $25,000 is currently offered for information leading to answers. In recent years, the Sheriff's Office tried a new approach, pushing the details of Susan's disappearance to tablet devices issued to inmates in Washington County Jail on the theory that someone in that population might know something. The case was featured on Dateline NBC in 2024. Tips came in. The investigation continues. What's left is a 19-year-old who worked 2 jobs, who called her mother to say she was coming home, who stopped 1 mile away when her car failed in the worst storm of the month. Her glasses, still in the locked car, fogged over with Minnesota cold. Her purse on the seat, her driver's license inside it. 1 mile. Susan was 1 mile from home when everything went wrong. The next man had 122 square miles between him and anyone who could help. The Susan Swedell case has a quality that distinguishes it from the other disappearances in this list, and it's this: almost every detail suggests premeditation. The petcock on the radiator didn't loosen itself. A person in a leather jacket in a blizzard at a rural gas station 1 mile from her home didn't wander there by accident. The timing that the car would overheat precisely at that station, at that time of night, in conditions where Susan would be stranded and alone, isn't the kind of thing that happens by coincidence. If investigators are right that the car was tampered with, then someone began planning this before Susan ever left work that day. Someone watched her, learned her schedule, identified her car, followed it or waited for it, and was ready. The question that investigators have carried for nearly 40 years is who? The description of the man at the gas station, the sandy brown hair, the leather jacket, the build matches no one they have been able to place. Dale, the man who called her at work, has never been identified despite decades of investigation. The apartment was entered by someone who knew where the spare key was, which implies knowledge of the family's home and their habits. None of these threads have ever pulled tight enough to produce a name. There's a particular detail that Susan's family has held on to. On the day she disappeared, before she changed out of the red pantsuit and into the short skirt, she had been wearing the red pantsuit all day. The skirt she changed into made no sense for a blizzard unless she was going to be somewhere warm, somewhere inside, somewhere she wanted to look a certain way. Whether that was her idea or someone else's instruction is unknown. Whether she was meeting someone willingly or was coerced into dressing that way before leaving work has never been established. The red pantsuit ended up under her bed in an apartment she may or may not have physically entered after she vanished. And Susan Swedell has not been seen since January 19, 1988. 1 mile, that's the distance. Everything that happened to her happened inside of 1 mile. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness sits in the far northeast corner of Minnesota, near the Canadian border, over 1 million acres of forest, granite, and water, with no roads cutting through most of it. It's one of the last truly remote places left in the lower 48. There's no cell service. There's no quick way out if something goes wrong. You go in carrying everything you need, and the wilderness doesn't care whether you're experienced or not. Lloyd Skelton was experienced. That's what makes this case so hard to explain. Lloyd Harold Skelton was 57 years old, a Minneapolis resident with a long history of serious outdoor experience. He had hiked the Grand Teton Range in Wyoming. He had kayaked through parts of Canada. He had traveled to Greenland, to Alaska, to Cuba, the kind of itinerary that belongs to someone who is comfortable being far from help, who plans carefully, who understands what wilderness demands of a person. He wasn't a novice wandering into something over his head. He was someone who had spent decades proving he knew exactly what he was doing. On June 4, 2005, Lloyd purchased a day-use permit at the Angleworm Lake Trail, located off the Echo Trail Road, about 10 miles northwest of Ely, Minnesota. Angleworm is a 13.2-mile rocky loop trail that circles Angleworm Lake, with roughly 1,525 feet of elevation gain across its length. Not an easy walk, even for someone in good shape. He told an outfitter near the trailhead that the weather was too miserable to paddle that day, heavy rain, cold for June. He left his kayak in his van. He told his family he expected to be gone for about a week, which was typical for his solo wilderness trips. Then he walked into the Boundary Waters. He never walked back out. His daughter Lisa reported him missing on June 15th, when he hadn't returned and hadn't made contact. 2 days later, on June 17th, his van was located at the Angleworm Trail parking lot, exactly where he'd left it. This is where the first wrong note in the case appears. The kayak was still inside the van. His camping gear was still loaded. Nothing about the vehicle suggested he'd left in a hurry, or that anything had gone wrong before he even started his hike. It looked exactly like a vehicle belonging to someone who'd gone for a day hike and planned to come back to it, not like someone preparing for an extended solo wilderness expedition. The presence of all that untouched gear became one of the case's lingering questions. Was Lloyd planning a longer trip than the day-use permit suggested, or had something gone wrong faster than anyone expected? Search teams from the St. Louis County Rescue Squad deployed almost immediately after the van was found. Search dogs were brought in and given Lloyd's scent. They picked up a trail and followed it approximately 4.5 miles into the wilderness, into the stretch of trail between Angleworm Lake and a smaller body of water called Whiskey Jack Lake. There, searchers found his clothing scattered, not neatly placed along with his wallet. Here's the critical detail, and it's the one that makes this case feel different from a simple hiking accident. Clothing scattered along a trail, far from camp, with no body anywhere nearby, is a pattern investigators recognize. It's consistent with something called paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon that occurs in the late stages of severe hypothermia, where the body's temperature regulation breaks down so completely that a freezing person suddenly feels overwhelmingly hot and begins removing their clothes in a state of confusion and physical crisis. It happens most often in extreme cold, but it can happen in cold rain too, especially to someone who's wet, exhausted, and alone, with no way to warm back up. This is where it stops being a hiking trip and becomes something else. If hypothermia is what happened to Lloyd Skelton, then somewhere along that trail, in the cold June rain, his body began to fail in a way that overrode decades of wilderness experience. He would have become disoriented, confused, compelled to remove his own clothing in conditions that were actively killing him, and then nothing. No body was ever found near where the clothing was scattered. No remains were located anywhere along the trail, in the brush, in the water, or in the surrounding terrain. But here's what doesn't make sense. Hypothermia victims who undergo paradoxical undressing typically die in place, not far from where the confusion set in. Searchers found his clothes. They did not find him. The Boundary Waters has no roads. There was no way for a body to be moved by anything other than the terrain itself, water current, animal activity, or the simple fact that the area is so vast and so difficult to search exhaustively that a body could remain hidden indefinitely, in dense brush, in deep water, in terrain that doesn't allow for the kind of grid search that worked, however incompletely, in the Brandon Swanson case. This is where you have to understand the scale of the search problem. In southwest Minnesota, investigators eventually covered 122 square miles of farmland looking for Brandon Swanson flat, accessible terrain. Even if some of it required negotiating with private landowners, the Boundary Waters offers no such accessibility. There are no roads. Search teams have to travel by canoe or on foot, carrying their own equipment, covering ground at a fraction of the speed possible anywhere else in this list. The wilderness that made Lloyd's solo trips meaningful to him is the same wilderness that has made finding him 20 years later effectively impossible. The St. Louis County Rescue Squad continued searching through the weekend following the discovery of his clothing. Cadaver dogs indicated continued scent activity in an area northwest of Whiskey Jack Lake territory, beyond where the clothing was found, suggesting either that Lloyd had continued moving after losing his clothes, or that something had carried scent traces further into the wilderness. The search could not be completed in that area due to the remoteness and difficulty of the terrain. To this day, the St. Louis County Sheriff's Office considers the case officially active. Rescue squad teams have reportedly used the unresolved search area for ongoing training exercises in the years since, a working acknowledgement that the search was never truly finished, just abandoned by necessity. There's a detail that sits uncomfortably with the hypothermia theory, and it's worth naming directly. June in Minnesota is not January. The weather that day was reportedly cold and rainy for the season, but not the kind of brutal cold typically associated with fatal hypothermia. It's possible. Cold rain combined with wind and prolonged exposure can cause hypothermia even in summer months, especially for someone alone, exhausted, and far from shelter. But it's also the detail that keeps this case from feeling fully resolved, even as a tragic accident. An experienced outdoorsman, someone who had survived genuinely extreme conditions in Alaska and Greenland, succumbing to hypothermia on a day hike in June, it's possible, but it doesn't sit easily. A second theory considered by investigators is a sudden medical emergency, a cardiac event, a stroke, something that could strike a 57-year-old man regardless of his fitness level, with the same ultimate outcome: collapse, alone, in terrain too remote and too vast to guarantee discovery. What investigators do not know, and what remains officially unconfirmed, is whether Lloyd Skelton was alone on that trail at all. No other hikers have ever come forward as having seen him after he left the trailhead. Whether anyone else was on the Angleworm Lake Trail that day, whether anyone crossed paths with him, remains unknown. His blue 2000 Plymouth Sport van sat in that trailhead parking lot for days before it was found the kayak still loaded inside, gear packed for a trip that, as far as anyone can tell, he never got the chance to take. There is something about the Lloyd Skelton case that separates it from the others in this list. And it isn't the absence of evidence, it's the absence of any contradiction sharp enough to point toward foul play, paired with an absence of confirmation sharp enough to fully accept an accident. Most of the disappearances in this list have a detail that breaks the simple explanation. A phone call that doesn't match a location, a car that was clearly tampered with, a scent trail that leads somewhere strange. Lloyd's case doesn't have that kind of break. Everything points toward the wilderness, simply doing what the wilderness sometimes does to even the most experienced people who enter it. And yet the not knowing is its own kind of unresolved horror. 20 years on, his daughter has no remains to bury, no closure beyond the clothing found scattered along a remote stretch of trail between two lakes that most people will never see in person. Echo Trail, the gravel road that leads to the Angleworm trailhead, runs for miles through dense forest before it even reaches pavement. Anyone driving it today passes the same parking lot where Lloyd's van sat for 2 weeks before anyone realized he hadn't come home. The trail itself remains open, still used by hikers every season, circling the same lake, crossing the same 4.5-mile stretch where his clothes were found. People walk that section without knowing what happened there. The forest has no memory. It just keeps growing over whatever it's holding on to. The Boundary Waters does not give up its secrets easily, and in Lloyd Skelton's case, it hasn't given up anything at all. Consider what an experienced wilderness traveler carries in his head before every trip. Lloyd would have known the signs of hypothermia better than most people ever will. He would have known to layer properly, to keep dry, to recognize the early confusion that signals the body is losing its battle with the cold. That knowledge is exactly what makes the scattered clothing so unsettling. Paradoxical undressing doesn't ask permission. It overrides training, overrides instinct, overrides decades of experience in places far colder and far more dangerous than a rainy June day in northern Minnesota. If that's what happened to Lloyd, it happened despite everything he knew, not because of anything he failed to know. And if it isn't what happened, if the clothing tells a different story than the official one, then the case becomes something else entirely. A staged scene. a struggle that ended in clothing torn or removed by someone other than Lloyd himself. Investigators have never publicly confirmed evidence pointing in that direction, and absent that confirmation, the hypothermia theory remains the working explanation. But working explanation and confirmed answer are not the same thing, and 20 years without a single bone keeps that gap wide open every season for anyone who still walks that trail. Lloyd went into the wilderness and didn't come back. The next case starts in a parking lot, 30 seconds from an apartment door. Mason City, Iowa, sits about half an hour south of the Minnesota border, a small market town with a local CBS affiliate that broadcasts the morning news to the surrounding counties. It's not Minnesota, not technically, but Jody Huizentrout was Minnesota through and through. Born and raised in Long Prairie, a small central Minnesota town that connects, in ways that become clearer later, to other names on this list. On the morning of June 27, 1995, Jody had 12 steps to cross between her apartment door and her car. She didn't make it. Jody Sue Huizentrout was 27 years old, the morning anchor at KIMT-TV, the CBS affiliate covering Mason City and the surrounding region. She had grown up in Long Prairie, Minnesota, gone to college, and built a career in local broadcast news with the kind of trajectory that suggested bigger markets were coming. She had been actively applying for anchor positions in the Twin Cities. Colleagues described her as driven, well-liked, talented, someone whose career was clearly headed somewhere. The day before she disappeared, she'd played in a golf tournament. She was, by every account, living an ordinary, ascending life. There's a detail about Jody's past that wouldn't matter to most missing persons cases, but matters enormously here. Years before her disappearance, Jody had personally interviewed Patty Wetterling, the mother of Jacob Wetterling, the 11-year-old boy abducted near St. Joseph, Minnesota, in 1989, a case still unsolved at the time, a case that had transformed Patty Wetterling into one of the most recognizable child safety advocates in the country. Jody sat across from a mother whose child had vanished into the dark and asked her questions about loss and the unknown. 6 years later, Jody herself would become exactly that kind of unknown. On the morning of June 27th, Jody's producer, Amy Coons, called her apartment at 4 to 10 in the morning. Doing what was apparently a regular routine, a wake-up call to make sure their morning anchor was up and moving, Jody answered. She told Amy she had overslept and was on her way. That was the last confirmed conversation anyone had with Jody Huizentrout. By 6 in the morning, the anchor desk was empty. Jody hadn't shown up. She hadn't called back. For a morning news producer, this is the kind of emergency that doesn't have a script. Calls went unanswered. By 7:13, police were notified. Here's the critical detail. When officers arrived at the Key apartment complex parking lot, Jody's car was there, but Jody wasn't. Scattered across the pavement near her car were the contents of what should have been a routine morning: a blow dryer, hairspray, an earring, and a car key bent, not lost, bent in a way consistent with a violent struggle for control of it. This is where it stops being a missed alarm and becomes something else entirely. The distance between Jody's apartment door and her parked car has been described by those familiar with the layout as roughly a dozen steps, 30 seconds, maybe less, of exposure between the safety of her home and the safety of her locked car. Whatever happened to Jody happened in that gap. A neighbor later reported hearing a scream sometime between 4 and 5 in the morning, consistent with the window of time between her phone call with Amy Coons and the moment she should have arrived at the station. A separate witness reported seeing a white Ford Econoline van idling in the apartment complex parking lot around the same time. Now this is where the case turns dark, because everything about that morning suggests Jody never had a chance to reach her car door. The bent key suggests a fight for control, someone grabbing for her keys, or grabbing for her, hard enough to bend metal. The scattered hair care items suggest she dropped what she was carrying, possibly while being grabbed or pulled. The scream, if it was hers, places the timeline almost precisely. She was attacked sometime in that narrow window after the 4 to 10 phone call and before her 6 o'clock shift. And the white van, idling, unclaimed by anyone in the apartment complex, has never been definitively traced to an owner connected to the case. A partial palm print was lifted from Jody's car. It has never been matched to a confirmed suspect in a way that resulted in charges. Over the following years, investigators identified and pursued multiple persons of interest. One name that has circulated publicly for decades is John Van Cis, a man described in media coverage as having been on investigators' radar for a long time. He has consistently denied any involvement. He has never been charged. 2 separate federal grand juries have convened to examine evidence in this case over the years. Neither resulted in an indictment. Jody was declared legally dead in 2001, 6 years after she vanished, a formality that allowed her estate to be settled, but that brought her family no actual answers about what happened to her or where she is. In 2008, a strange and unexplained development occurred. An 84-page personal journal belonging to Jody was anonymously mailed to a newspaper. The journal had been missing since her disappearance. Who had it for 13 years, and why they chose to send it anonymously in 2008 has never been explained. The contents reportedly offered insight into Jody's personal life and relationships in the period before she vanished, but did not produce a breakthrough in the investigation. The case received renewed national attention in July of 2025, when Hulu released a 3-part documentary titled Her Last Broadcast, examining the disappearance in depth. The documentary's production reportedly contributed to a private investigation that led searchers to a site in Winsted, Minnesota, roughly an hour and a half north of Mason City, in October of 2024. That search was conducted based on a specific tip connecting a location in Minnesota to the case. What, if anything, that search uncovered has not been publicly disclosed. The results remain officially unknown. Here's what doesn't make sense, even 30 years later. This was not a remote trailhead, not a blizzard-swept gas station a mile from home. This was a routine morning, in a familiar parking lot, with a coworker on the phone moments before, with a 6 o'clock shift waiting. Jody Huisentruit had every reason to expect she would make it to her car. Whoever was waiting for her in that parking lot knew her schedule well enough to be there at exactly the right moment, in the dark, before sunrise, before anyone else was likely to be outside. The bent key never got used to start her car. The earring never made it back into her ear. The blow dryer and hairspray sat scattered on the pavement, evidence of a morning that should have been completely unremarkable, evidence that someone interrupted it with violence in the span of about 30 seconds. The investigation into Jody's disappearance has spanned 3 decades, multiple law enforcement agencies, and an enormous volume of public attention, and yet the fundamental question what happened to her after she left her apartment that morning remains officially unanswered. The Mason City Police Department, later joined by the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, conducted thousands of interviews over the years. Tip lines have stayed open since 1995. A reward fund, contributed to by KIMT and members of the public, has grown over time, though it has never produced the breakthrough investigators were hoping for. What makes this case especially difficult to sit with is the contrast between how public Jody's life was and how completely private her disappearance has remained. She was a television personality. Her face was broadcast into homes across the region every weekday morning. People who had never met her felt like they knew her. And yet the most basic facts of what happened to her in those 30 seconds in the parking lot have stayed locked away for 30 years, known only to whoever was there. The connection to Patty Wetterling deserves a second look here, because it isn't just a coincidence of geography. Jody didn't just live in the same broad region as the Wetterling family. She sat across from Patty, professionally, as a journalist, asking a grieving mother to describe what it felt like not to know where her child was. Jody would have understood, perhaps better than most reporters her age, exactly what kind of suffering an unsolved disappearance creates for the people left behind. She couldn't have known she was about to become a case study in that same suffering herself. Investigators have also examined whether Jody's career ambitions, her active pursuit of larger television markets, played any role in who might have wanted to harm her, whether out of jealousy, obsession, or some other motive connected to her growing public profile. No confirmed evidence has tied her disappearance to anyone within her professional circle. The white van remains the most tangible lead that was never closed. Investigators at the time canvassed the area for a vehicle matching that description and owner, without success. Whether the van belonged to someone with a legitimate reason to be in that parking lot before dawn, or whether it belonged to the person responsible for what happened to Jody, has never been resolved. The Winstead search, in October of 2024, represented the most significant renewed investigative activity in years. Search teams, working from a specific tip developed during the documentary's production, conducted a methodical search of the identified site. As of this telling, no public statement has confirmed whether remains, evidence, or any conclusive findings resulted from that search. Families of the missing learn, often the hard way, that a new search does not guarantee a new answer, and the Huisentrut family has now waited 3 decades for one. There's something particularly haunting about the way this case sits in the public record. Unlike a wilderness disappearance, where the absence of cell towers and roads can at least explain why a body was never found, Jody vanished from the middle of a populated apartment complex, in a town, with neighbors close enough to hear a scream. The infrastructure of an ordinary American morning was right there. Parked cars, lit windows, a police department minutes away, and none of it was enough. Whoever was responsible moved fast, moved quietly enough not to be stopped, and has never been definitively named in 30 years of investigation. The anchor chair at KIMT sat empty that morning, while viewers waited for a familiar face that never appeared. Somewhere behind the scenes, a producer who had spoken to Jody 20 minutes earlier was now realizing something had gone catastrophically wrong, with no way yet to know just how wrong it would turn out to be, or how long the not knowing would stretch on for the people who loved her. Hit subscribe if you want to go deeper on cases like this. The next case vanished in the middle of a summer morning on a quiet lakeshore in Wright County. Wright County, Minnesota, is lake country, the kind of place where summer means cabins, docks, and quiet mornings on the water. Little Eagle Lake sits in the middle of that landscape, surrounded by private homes, the kind of place where neighbors trust each other enough to leave a key under the mat and ask someone to watch the house while they're gone. On the morning of June 15, 1974, Belinda Van Lith was doing exactly that. By the time anyone came back, she was gone. What's publicly known about Belinda Van Lith is, frankly, less than what's known about almost any other case in this list, and that absence of detail is itself part of the story. Her age at the time of her disappearance has not been consistently documented in public records. What is known is that she was house-sitting for a neighbor at a residential property on Little Eagle Lake, alone, on a quiet summer morning in central Minnesota. She was last seen around 8 o'clock that morning. When the homeowner returned to the property sometime later, Belinda was simply not there. No note, no indication of where she'd gone or why. Nothing to suggest she'd left voluntarily, and nothing concrete enough, in the public record at least, to definitively prove she didn't. This is one of those cases where the silence is louder than the details. Official accounts have suggested foul play is suspected, though the specifics of why investigators reached that conclusion in 1974, what evidence, if any, pointed towards something more sinister than a young woman simply walking away, have not been made widely available to the public. What was left behind at the scene, whether her belongings were untouched, whether there was any sign of disturbance, remains officially unknown based on available reporting. Here's what doesn't make sense, even accounting for how little information exists. A house-sitting job is, by definition, a known location, a known schedule, and often a known absence of other people nearby. Whoever was responsible if foul play did occur would have needed to know that Belinda was alone at that property, at that time, with no one else expected to interrupt. That's not necessarily evidence of a stranger. It's the kind of knowledge that suggests someone who knew the neighborhood, the homeowner's habits, or Belinda's own schedule. Or it could be exactly what it looks like on the surface. A young woman who, for reasons never recorded or never recovered, walked away from a quiet lake property on an ordinary summer morning and never came back. The case has remained cold for more than 50 years. It has drawn renewed attention in recent years through podcast coverage The Deck, a podcast focused specifically on Minnesota cold cases, dedicated a 2-part episode to Belinda's disappearance, examining what little is publicly known and calling for anyone with information to come forward. Crime Stoppers of Minnesota continues to list the case as active, with the standard offer of anonymous tip submission for anyone who might know something, even decades later. What's striking about a case like Belinda's, compared to the others in this list, is how thin the public record remains, even after half a century. Cases like Brandon Swanson's or Jodi Huisentruit's have generated extensive media coverage, repeated searches, documentary attention, federal involvement. Belinda Van Lith's case has none of that scale. It exists mostly in local memory, in cold case files, in the kind of quiet persistence that keeps a 50-year-old disappearance technically open without ever generating the resources to actually close it. That's its own kind of unsettling. Somewhere in Wright County, Minnesota, there is presumably someone, or there was someone, 50 years ago who knows what happened on Little Eagle Lake that morning. Whether they're still alive, whether they ever told anyone, whether the truth is sitting quietly in someone's memory, never spoken, while the official case remains exactly where it was in 1974, open, unresolved, waiting. A Minnesota lake in June, still and quiet. The neighbor's house exactly as it was left, and Belinda, simply, not there. Belinda disappeared from a lakeside property with no witnesses. The next case had witnesses, a shopping trip, a familiar route, and two sisters who never came home. Labor Day weekend, 1974, the same year as Belinda's disappearance, though there's no known connection between the cases beyond timing and geography. St. Cloud, Minnesota, a central Minnesota city in Stearns County, the same county that would later become infamous for two of the most significant unsolved cases in state history. Two sisters left their family home on foot, heading toward a discount store about a mile away to pick up school supplies before the new year started. They never made it home. Mary Reeker was 15. Susan Reeker was 12. They were sisters, close in the way siblings often are when one is old enough to look out for the other, walking a route they'd walked before, toward a Zayre discount store that served as the neighborhood's go-to spot for exactly this kind of errand. Their parents watched them leave the house on foot. That was the last confirmed sighting either parent had of their daughters. There's a detail about Mary that has haunted this case since it first came to light. And it's not something investigators discovered through forensic work. It's something Mary wrote herself, in her own diary, before she disappeared. The entry reads, in essence, as a kind of premonition. If she were ever murdered, she wanted whoever found her diary to make sure her killer was identified and that justice was done. She wrote that she had reasons to fear for her life, and that what she was asking mattered. A 15-year-old girl, writing those words in a private diary, weeks or months before she and her younger sister vanished on a routine walk to a discount store. This is where the case turns from a missing persons report into something far darker. The girls did not return that day. As the hours stretched into evening, their parents grew alarmed, then frantic. A search was launched, but in 1974, before the kind of coordinated, technology-assisted searches that exist today, locating two missing children in a city the size of St. Cloud meant relying almost entirely on community canvassing, police legwork, and hope. Days passed, then weeks. The Recker family lived through 26 days of not knowing 26 days where the only honest answer to, "Where are Mary and Susan?" was nothing at all. On day 26, the silence broke, but not in the way any family hopes for. The bodies of both girls were found in a quarry outside St. Cloud, a site removed from any route they would have taken on their walk to the store, removed from anywhere their parents would have expected them to be. The discovery answered the most basic question hanging over the case, that the girls had not run away, had not simply gotten lost, had not chosen to disappear on their own, but it opened a far darker set of questions that, more than 50 years later, remain unanswered. How were two girls, a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old, transported from a 1-mile walking route between their home and a discount store to a quarry outside city limits? Who took them there? At what point during that walk did something go wrong? None of these questions have ever been definitively answered. No one has ever been charged in connection with the deaths of Mary and Susan Recker. Here's what doesn't make sense, and what has kept investigators and amateur researchers alike returning to this case for half a century. A 1-mile walk, in daylight, on Labor Day weekend, in a city, should be one of the safest possible errands two sisters could run together. There were no remote trails, no isolated highways, no blizzard conditions working against them. Just a sidewalk, a store, and a walk home that never happened. Public reporting over the years has connected the case to a person referred to in some accounts by the nickname Notch, a young man around Mary's age, whose family lived in Luxembourg, a small town the Wrecker family was known to visit, and who reportedly worked at the Zayri store the girls were walking toward. This connection has circulated in media coverage and amateur investigation for years. It is important to be precise about what this represents. A publicly reported association, not a confirmed charge, not an arrest, not a conviction. No one has ever been formally accused in a court of law in connection with the Wrecker case. Any name connected to it in public discussion remains, officially, unconfirmed. In 2017, Fox 9 conducted an investigation into the case that reportedly surfaced new information, potentially linking the disappearance to another crime in the region. That investigation did not result in charges. The same year, author Robert Dudley, a researcher who had also done extensive work connecting threads in the Jacob Wetterling case, published a book examining the Wrecker case in detail, drawing on decades of accumulated research and renewed public interest. The institutional thread running through this case deserves its own attention. The investigation into Mary and Susan Reeker's deaths was handled by law enforcement in Stearns County, the same broad institutional environment that would later be criticized for its handling of the Joshua Guimond disappearance in 2002, and that spent 27 years failing to resolve the abduction of Jacob Wetterling before finally securing a confession in 2016. Three of the most significant unresolved or slow-resolved cases in Minnesota history, all rooted in the same county, spanning 4 decades. Whether that reflects something specific about how cases were investigated in that jurisdiction during this era, or whether it's simply the statistical weight of tragedy accumulating in one place over time, is a question that has never been formally and publicly answered by any oversight body. Rita Wrecker, the girl's mother, became one of the case's most persistent advocates in the decades following her daughter's deaths, pushing for renewed attention, renewed investigation, any thread that might finally produce an answer. She held on to hope for justice for the rest of her life. The diary, Mary's diary, with that haunting entry written before any of this happened, remains part of the case file. The handwriting of a 15-year-old who may have sensed something was wrong long before anyone else did. What stays with people about this case isn't just the diary entry, though it's impossible to read those words without a chill. It's the ordinariness of everything leading up to it. 2 sisters running an errand any family would consider routine, on a holiday weekend, in broad daylight, in a Minnesota city. The quarry where they were found has nothing to do with school supplies or a discount store. Somewhere between the front door and that quarry, the entire shape of an ordinary afternoon broke apart, and 50 years later, no one outside, whoever was responsible, knows exactly how or exactly why. 2 sisters, 1 mile, 40 years without answers. The next case is closer in time, and the answers, when they finally came, only opened new questions. New Brighton, Minnesota is an inner ring suburb of the Twin Cities, the kind of place that doesn't feel remote at all. Sidewalks, parks, families, the ordinary texture of suburban Ramsey County life. But tucked inside that suburban landscape are pockets that don't get much foot traffic. The Lake Jones area is one of them, wooded, wet, the kind of overlooked green space that exists in nearly every suburb, present but unremarkable until it isn't. Haley Elizabeth Amar disappeared from New Brighton in December of 2015. The publicly available details about the circumstances of her disappearance are limited, far more limited than most of the other cases in this list, which is itself part of what makes this case so unsettling. Mounds View Police Department, which has jurisdiction in the area, investigated her case for nearly a decade without a resolution. No body, no confirmed cause, no charges. Just an open file that sat, year after year, without the kind of breakthrough that gives a family something to hold on to. For almost 10 years, that's where the case remained, in a kind of suspended uncertainty that's arguably one of the cruelest outcomes a missing persons case can produce. Not the finality of a known death, not the impossible hope of someone still being out there, just absence, stretching on, year after year, with investigators following leads that led nowhere and a family left to wonder. This is where the case turns dark and where the geography of this disappearance becomes impossible to ignore. On March 1st, 2025, More than 9 years after Haley vanished, a human skull was discovered in the Lake Jones area of New Brighton. The discovery triggered an immediate 3-day search by the New Brighton Department of Public Safety, combing the surrounding wooded and wetland terrain for any additional remains or evidence. The area is heavily wooded, wet underfoot, the kind of overgrown suburban green space that people drive past every day without a second thought. Here's the critical detail. The Lake Jones area isn't a remote wilderness location. It's not a 13-mile loop deep in the boundary waters, not a stretch of unmarked farmland 25 miles from anywhere. It's inside a suburb. It's the kind of place where kids ride bikes, where dog walkers pass through, where the assumption is always that nothing stays hidden for very long in a populated area. And yet, for 9 years, something did. Identification of the remains took time. Dental record comparison was used to confirm the identity, and in early 2026, authorities confirmed what the family had likely feared for nearly a decade. The skull belonged to Haley Amar. But here's what doesn't make sense. Even with identification confirmed, a name now exists where there was once only absence. A location now exists where there was once only speculation. And yet the most important question, what actually happened to Haley Amar between December of 2015 and whatever brought her remains to that wetland, remains officially unknown. No cause of death has been confirmed. No circumstances have been publicly released. The case is being treated as suspicious, which is about as much as can honestly be said at this point. New Brighton officials, in their public communications around the time of Haley's disappearance, sought information about her acquaintances and her activities in the days leading up to December of 2015, language that suggests investigators were looking closely at the people in her life, at her routines, at anyone who might have had contact with her in that window. Whether those inquiries ever produced a viable suspect, or whether they simply represent standard investigative procedure that didn't lead anywhere conclusive, is something the public record does not clarify. What you're left with, even after identification, is a strange and incomplete kind of resolution. The not knowing of where Haley was has ended. The not knowing of what happened to her has not. There's a particular kind of unease that comes from learning that a missing person was, the entire time, within a few miles of where they were last seen, not transported across state lines, not buried in some remote stretch of wilderness, but present, the whole time, inside the boundaries of the same community that searched for her. It reframes the entire decade of investigation. Every search that went outward, every tip that pointed towards some distant location, every theory that imagined Haley far from home, all of it existed alongside a truth that was, geographically, much closer than anyone realized. The 9-year gap between Haley's disappearance and the discovery of her remains raises uncomfortable questions about how thoroughly that wetland area was searched in the initial investigation. Back in December of 2015, wooded, wet terrain is notoriously difficult to search exhaustively, the kind of ground that swallows evidence under leaf litter, beneath standing water, into the kind of dense underbrush that even a careful initial search can miss. Whether the area was searched at all in 2015, and if so, how thoroughly, has not been detailed in available public reporting. What's clear is that whatever happened to bring Haley to that wetland, it happened before anyone began looking, and the answer sat largely undisturbed for nearly a decade afterward. The Mounds View Police Department has continued to treat the case as an active investigation since the identification was confirmed, working now from a starting point investigators didn't have for 9 years. A confirmed location, a confirmed identity, and a timeline that can finally be anchored to physical evidence rather than speculation. Whether that's enough to finally produce the answer of how Haley died, and at whose hands, if anyone's, remains to be seen, but for the first time in nearly 10 years, investigators have somewhere solid to start from. A wooded shoreline in a suburb, the kind of place kids ride bikes past without a second thought. The skull was 10 years in the mud, 10 years of seasons changing over it, 10 years of a family in New Brighton not knowing their daughter was that close the entire time. A skull found in a suburban park. The next case, a 76-year-old grandmother who left for a cabin and never arrived. Champlin, Minnesota, sits on the northern edge of the Twin Cities metro, a quiet community where the highway leads out toward Wisconsin Lake Country, the kind of route that thousands of Minnesotans drive every summer, heading toward family cabins, toward 4th of July gatherings, toward exactly the kind of trip Georgia Smith had made before. Georgia Smith was 76 years old in July of 1999. She had a lakeside cabin to reach in Wisconsin, where her family was gathering for the 4th of July holiday. The plan was simple, the kind of plan made by families across the upper Midwest every summer. Georgia would drive out early, ahead of the rest of the family, to open up the cabin and get things ready before everyone else arrived. She never made it. When the rest of the family arrived at the cabin, Georgia wasn't there. No call, no message explaining a delay, just an empty cabin where a beloved grandmother was supposed to be waiting. This is where it stops being a simple case of a missed turn or a late arrival. Here's what's available in the public record, and it's worth being honest about how little that is. The exact stretch of road Georgia was traveling, the precise time she left Champlin, whatever last sighting might exist of her along that route. These details are not part of the widely available public reporting on this case. What is known is that her car was never located, and Georgia herself was never located. The Champlin Police Department continues to list the case as active, and Crime Stoppers of Minnesota maintains it among the state's unresolved disappearances, with a direct line for anyone with information. What makes Georgia's case difficult to sit with isn't a single dramatic detail. There's no bent car key, no tampered radiator, no diary entry that reads like a warning. It's the absolute ordinariness of the drive she was making. This wasn't a wilderness hike or a midnight walk through unfamiliar farmland. It was a route she had driven before, toward a destination she knew well, on a weekend that thousands of families across 2 states were making the exact same kind of trip. And that's exactly what makes it unsettling. If a 76-year-old woman can disappear completely on a familiar highway route that gets driven by thousands of people every single summer, with no trace of her car, no trace of her, nothing, then the ordinary infrastructure of an everyday Minnesota summer offers less safety than it appears to. A cabin on a Wisconsin lake prepared for a gathering that started with an empty parking spot, a missing grandmother, and a question that has never been answered in 25 years. There's a quiet kind of dread specific to this case, separate from the gas stations and parking lots and wilderness trails of the other disappearances on this list. Georgia Smith's case involves no scene at all, no abandoned vehicle, no scattered belongings, no last confirmed sighting from a witness who can describe a stranger's car or a stranger's face. It's a complete absence stretched across an entire stretch of highway, somewhere between a suburb north of the Twin Cities and a lake in Wisconsin. A car carrying a 76-year-old woman went out onto a public road in broad daylight and simply never reappeared anywhere, not at the destination, not back at home, not at any point along the route that investigators have ever been able to identify. When a case has this little physical evidence attached to it, investigators are left working almost entirely from absence. The absence of a car at any gas station, rest stop, or impound lot. The absence of any reported accident matching her vehicle. The absence of any sighting, however unreliable, from anyone along that corridor. Decades of searching that kind of negative space rarely produces answers, and Georgia's case has borne that out. What remains is a family that gathered at a lake for a holiday and instead spent the rest of their lives wondering what happened on the road that should have brought her there safely. The case sits in stark contrast to several others in this list. Susan Swedell's disappearance involved a sabotaged car, a witnessed encounter, a tampered radiator that told investigators someone had planned ahead. Jody Husentrut's disappearance left behind a bent key and a scattered struggle. Georgia Smith's disappearance left behind almost nothing publicly documented at all, which makes it one of the hardest cases on this list to analyze. And, for that same reason, one of the hardest to let go of. An entire car, an entire person, vanishing somewhere between 2 known points on a map that millions of people drive safely every single year. Georgia set out for a summer cabin and disappeared. The last case is the one that changed Minnesota forever. And even though it was solved, parts of it never will be. Stearns County, Minnesota, the same county that struggled to find Joshua Guimond on a college campus. the same county where the Wrecker sisters were last seen walking toward a discount store. On October 22, 1989, on a rural road near St. Matter, Joseph, an 11-year-old boy, was riding bikes with his brother and a friend when a masked man stepped out of a driveway. He pointed a gun. He told the other two boys to run, and he took Jacob. Jacob Irwin Wetterling was 11 years old, growing up in rural Stearns County, the way a lot of Minnesota kids did in the late 1980s, riding bikes with his younger brother Trevor and a friend. On a quiet October evening, on a road near his family's home outside St. Joseph. It was the kind of evening that happens thousands of times in rural Minnesota without incident. This one didn't end that way. A man wearing a mask emerged from a driveway along the road. He was armed. He confronted the three boys and ordered Trevor and the friend to run into the woods and not look back, threatening to shoot if they did. They ran. When they finally looked back, Jacob and the man were gone. This is the kind of crime that doesn't have an escalation ladder in the way the other cases in this list do. There was no slow unraveling, no missed phone call, no gradual realization that something was wrong. It was immediate, and it was witnessed. Trevor and his friend ran home and told Jacob's parents what had happened. Police were called that same night. What followed was one of the most extensive criminal investigations in Minnesota history, and one that would not produce an answer for 27 years. In the years immediately following Jacob's abduction, the case became something larger than a single missing child investigation. It became a catalyst for nationwide legal reform. In 1994, the Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children and Sexually Violent Offender Registration Act was signed into federal law, establishing the framework that would eventually become the National Sex Offender Registry used across the United States today. A law named after a boy whose own case it couldn't solve. Jacob's mother, Patty Wetterling, became one of the most recognized advocates for missing and exploited children in the country. She testified before Congress. She helped shape national policy. She turned an unimaginable loss into decades of public work aimed at protecting other families from experiencing the same nightmare, all while her own son's case remained unsolved, year after year, decade after decade. Investigators pursued hundreds of suspects over those 27 years. Searches were conducted. Leads were chased down and abandoned. The case occasionally resurfaced in the news with renewed tips or renewed hope, only to settle back into the same painful uncertainty that had defined it since 1989. For an entire generation of Minnesotans who grew up in the years after Jacob's abduction, his name became shorthand for a specific kind of fear. The awareness that something like this could happen on an ordinary road, on an ordinary evening, to an ordinary family. Here's where the case finally turned, and it took nearly 3 decades to get there. In 2010, the name Danny Heinrich first surfaced in connection with the investigation, identified by investigators as a person worth examining more closely. But it would be another 5 years before that thread led anywhere conclusive. In 2015, Heinrich was arrested not initially on charges directly related to Jacob's case, but in connection with other offenses. As part of a plea agreement in 2016, Heinrich confessed to abducting and killing Jacob Wetterling in 1989. He led investigators to a farm in rural Stearns County, where Jacob's remains had been buried for 27 years. 27 years. A community that had searched, prayed, advocated, and waited, finally had an answer delivered not through a triumphant break in the case, but through a plea deal struck for an entirely different set of crimes. Nearly 3 decades after, a masked man stepped out of a driveway on a quiet October evening. This case is presented differently than the others on this list, because unlike the rest, it has been solved. Danny Heinrich is currently serving a 20-year sentence. But the resolution that finally came in 2016 raises its own uncomfortable questions. And the weight of this case has never fully lifted, even with a confession on record. Here's what doesn't make sense. Even with the case technically closed, Heinrich's name came up on investigators' radar in 2010. Charges weren't brought, and a confession wasn't secured until 2016, 6 more years, during which Jacob's family continued to wait, continued to not know, while the person responsible was already a known name to law enforcement. What happened in those 6 years? What evidence was being gathered? What legal and investigative hurdles delayed a resolution that had effectively been within reach? These questions sit at the center of ongoing criticism of how the case was ultimately closed. There are also questions that the resolution itself never answered. Whether Heinrich acted entirely alone has been a subject of ongoing speculation, never definitively closed by his confession. Whether his activities connect in any way to other unsolved cases in the region during the same era, including, in the speculation of some researchers and amateur investigators, threads connecting back to other names on this very list remains unconfirmed and, in the absence of further evidence or charges, should be treated as exactly that: speculation, not established fact. What is established is this: a community that spent 27 years not knowing finally received an answer. A mother who built a national advocacy movement out of unimaginable grief finally knew where her son was. And the same investigative agency that took 27 years to resolve this case would, in the years that followed, also be the agency working the unresolved disappearance of Joshua Guimond from a nearby college campus, and revisiting the still unsolved deaths of the Rieker sisters from 1974, three of the most consequential cases in Minnesota's history, all rooted in the same county, all carrying the same institutional fingerprints. A farm in Stearns County. A boy came home 27 years late, and the parents of every other family in this list are still waiting for that same call. There's a particular weight to closing out this list with Jacob Wetterling's case, and it isn't because his story offers the kind of resolution the others lack. In some ways, it's harder precisely because it was solved. Every other family in this list lives inside a question mark. The Wetterlings, for 27 years, lived inside that exact same uncertainty, and then, in 2016, the question mark closed. And what replaced it wasn't relief so much as a different, more concrete kind of grief. Knowing where Jacob had been for nearly 3 decades didn't undo any of the years spent not knowing. It simply changed the shape of what the family carried. The investigation itself deserves a closer look, because the 27-year gap between abduction and resolution wasn't simply a story of an unsolvable mystery. It was, in part, a story of investigative limitations specific to that era. In 1989, DNA analysis was still in its early stages as a forensic tool, and the kind of database matching that helps solve cold cases today simply didn't exist yet. Investigators in 1989 worked primarily from witness descriptions, physical evidence collected at the scene, and the laborious process of interviewing and re-interviewing anyone who might have had relevant knowledge. Over the following decades, as forensic technology advanced, cold case investigators revisited the file repeatedly, re-examining evidence with tools that hadn't existed when Jacob was first taken. Author Robert Dudley's research, published in 2015, is credited with contributing meaningful new threads to the reinvestigation that ultimately led to Heinrich. Dudley had also done extensive work on the Rieker sisters' case, drawing connections across cold cases in the same region. A researcher whose persistence outside of official law enforcement channels appears to have played a real role in finally moving Jacob's case toward resolution after so many years of institutional stagnation. When Heinrich was finally arrested in 2015, it wasn't initially for Jacob's abduction. He was charged in connection with separate offenses involving child pornography. It was during the plea negotiation process for those charges facing the prospect of a lengthy federal sentence, regardless of cooperation, that Heinrich agreed to confess to Jacob's murder and lead investigators to the TV burial site, in exchange for terms that would ultimately result in a 20-year sentence, specifically for that crime. The mechanics of how justice was finally delivered in this case are, themselves, uncomfortable to sit with. A confession secured not through an unstoppable accumulation of evidence pointing directly at Heinrich for Jacob's case specifically, but through a negotiated exchange tied to an entirely separate set of charges. This detail matters because it means the case was never definitively solved through traditional investigative breakthrough fingerprint, DNA match, eyewitness identification, connecting Heinrich directly to the scene in 1989. It was solved because Heinrich, facing different legal consequences, chose to talk. Had those separate charges never been brought, had Heinrich never been on investigators' radar for those unrelated offenses, there is a real possibility Jacob's case would still be unsolved today, the same way Joshua Guimon's case remains unsolved, the same way the Wrecker sisters' case remains unsolved. That possibility is what makes this case sit so heavily alongside the others in this list, even though it has technically been closed. The line between an unsolved Minnesota disappearance and a solved one, in Jacob's case, came down to circumstances that had nothing to do with the original 1989 investigation at all. It's a sobering thought for anyone trying to make sense of why some of these cases get answers and others don't. Sometimes the difference isn't better evidence, or smarter investigation, or more searching. Sometimes it's simply whether the person responsible happens to get caught for something else entirely, decades later, and decides to talk. Patty Wetterling has spoken publicly, in the years since Heinrich's confession, about the strange and complicated nature of finally knowing. The advocacy work she built over 27 years didn't stop when the case closed, if anything. It continued with the same focus, the same commitment to other families, experiencing the same nightmare she'd lived through. Jacob's name remains attached to federal law, to the foundational architecture of how this country tracks and monitors offenders against children, a legacy built entirely out of a tragedy that took nearly 3 decades to fully resolve. What this case ultimately offers, sitting at the close of this list, isn't comfort, it's perspective. 27 years is an almost unimaginable length of time to wait for an answer, and yet it happened, eventually, for one family. For the others in this list, that same length of time has already passed, or is well on its way to passing, with no Danny Heinrich, no plea deal, no farm in Stearns County waiting to give up its secret. Pull up that map again, the one from the very beginning. 10,000 lakes, forests, so thick the GPS stops working. Towns so quiet the neighbors all wave. You've spent the last several minutes tracing a route through this state, not on a vacation, not on a road trip, but through the last confirmed locations of 10 people who never made it to wherever they were supposed to be going. Here's what the map looks like now. Start in the southwest corner, in the flat farmland between Canby and Marshall, where Brandon Swanson made a phone call about a car in a ditch and ended it 25 miles from where anyone thought to look. That spot on the map is still just farmland. Crops still get planted there every spring. The Yellow Medicine River still runs through it, high in the spring and nearly dry some summers. The same river that was searched and searched again and gave up nothing. Move northeast, into Stearns County, onto a campus behind a curtain of pine trees, where a 3-minute walk between 2 dormitories swallowed a 20-year-old who wanted to be in Congress someday. St. John's University is still there. Students still walk that same path between Metten Court and St. T. Morehouse every single day, most of them with no idea that one of their predecessors took that walk in November of 2002 and simply never arrived. East to Washington County, to a gas station at the corner of 2 roads outside Lake Elmo, where a 19-year-old's car broke down exactly 1 mile from her front door, in the middle of the worst storm of the month, with a tampered radiator that may have made sure of it. The gas station has likely changed hands, changed its sign, changed its pumps, in the 30-some years since. The intersection is still there. The mile between it and her home is still there, north, into the boundary waters, where roads stop existing and the only way in is by foot or by canoe, to a rocky 13-mile loop trail circling a lake, where an experienced outdoorsman's clothing was found scattered 4.5 miles in, and nothing else ever was. The trail is still open. Hikers still walk it every season. Somewhere in that wilderness, the answer to what happened to Lloyd Skelton may still be sitting, untouched, in terrain too vast and too remote to ever fully search. South across the Iowa border, to a parking lot outside an apartment complex, 12 steps between a door and a car, where a morning news anchor lost a fight for her car keys in the dark before dawn. The Key apartment complex is still there in Mason City. The parking lot still exists. Somewhere, possibly not far from where she vanished, possibly much farther, the answer to what happened to Jody Huisentrut in those 30 seconds has stayed locked away for 30 years. Back into central Minnesota, to a quiet property on Little Eagle Lake in Wright County, where a young woman house-sitting alone vanished sometime after 8 in the morning, leaving behind almost no trace and almost no public record at all. 50 years later, the lake is still there, still quiet, still surrounded by the kind of trust that lets neighbors leave keys under doormats for each other. To St. Cloud, to a 1-mile walking route between a family home and a discount store, where 2 sisters left on a Labor Day afternoon and were found, 26 days later, in a quarry that had nothing to do with school supplies. The store is gone now, the building repurposed or demolished, the way old discount stores tend to be. The quarry is still there. Mary's diary entry is still part of the official case file, the handwriting of a 15-year-old who may have known more than anyone realized at the time. To New Brighton, to a wooded wetland called Lake Jones, inside the boundaries of an ordinary suburb, where a young woman's remains sat undiscovered for 9 years, before a skull surfaced in March of 2025, and gave her family an answer to one question, while leaving the larger one, what actually happened, to her completely open. Out along the highway corridor running from Champlin toward the Wisconsin border, the route a 76-year-old grandmother took toward a lake cabin in July of 1999, a route that thousands of families drive safely every single summer, and that swallowed her without leaving behind so much as a single confirmed trace. And finally, to a rural road outside St. Joseph in Stearns County, where a masked man stepped out of a driveway in October of 1989 and changed the entire trajectory of how this country handles cases like the other 9 on this list. Jacob Wetterling's case is the only one with an ending. 27 years late, but an ending nonetheless. A farm, a confession, a body finally brought home. 9 question marks. 1 period. That's the map as it stands today. What strikes you, once you've traced the whole route, is how unremarkable nearly every one of these places is. None of these are the kind of locations that scream danger. A gas station, a college campus, a parking lot, a discount store, a highway. These are the textures of ordinary Minnesota life. The places everyone in this state has been 100 times without a second thought. And that's precisely what makes this list so unsettling. The danger in these cases never announced itself in advance. It hid inside the most familiar settings imaginable, waiting for one ordinary night, one ordinary errand, one ordinary drive to go wrong in a way that could never be undone. There's a pattern that emerges when you look at these 10 cases side by side, beyond the geography, beyond the decades. It's the pattern of institutional response, or the lack of it, in the earliest, most critical hours of each case. Brandon Swanson's parents were told to wait. Joshua Guimon's family had to personally request elite dive teams, twice, while investigators chased a drowning theory that would take 21 years to officially rule out. The Recker family searched for 26 days before any resolution came, in an era before the kind of coordinated, technology-assisted investigation that exists today. Even Jacob Wetterling's case, the one case in this list that did eventually close, took 27 years. And the resolution that finally came wasn't the product of investigators cracking the case through traditional means. It came because the person responsible happened to be caught for something else entirely, and chose, for his own reasons, to talk. Stearns County alone carries the weight of 3 of the most significant cases on this list. Joshua Guimond, the Recker sisters, and Jacob Wetterling, spanning nearly 30 years and 3 completely different decades of Minnesota life. The same broad institutional environment touched all 3, and whether that reflects something specific about investigative culture in that jurisdiction during this era, or whether it's simply the cruel statistical weight of tragedy accumulating in one corner of the state, is a question that has never been formally and publicly answered by anyone with the authority to answer it. It's the kind of pattern that becomes visible only when you lay these cases out next to each other, the way this list has done, and once you see it, it's hard to unsee. There's also a pattern in who these cases happen to. A college student walking home from a card game, a teenager driving back from a graduation celebration, a working woman heading home after her shift, an experienced outdoorsman on a planned solo trip, a morning news anchor on her way to work, a house sitter watching over a quiet lake property, 2 sisters on a school supply errand, a young woman in a suburb just living her life, a grandmother driving to a family gathering, a child riding bikes with his brother. None of these are people who put themselves in obvious danger. None of them were doing anything other than the ordinary business of living in Minnesota. That's the through line connecting all 10 names on this list, not recklessness, not bad decisions, just the simple, terrifying reality that ordinary life sometimes intersects with something no one could have predicted or prepared for. Look again at the contradictions that run through these cases, the details that never quite resolve into a clean explanation. A petcock loosened just enough to fail at exactly the wrong moment. A computer wiped clean by hands that were never identified. A cell phone that stayed active for 2 days after its owner went silent. A diary entry written like a premonition months before it came true. A bloodhound that tracked 2 separate missing men's scents to the same isolated building. These aren't the kinds of details you find in a simple accident, or even in most violent crimes. They're the kinds of details that suggest planning, that suggest someone who understood exactly what they were doing and managed, in nearly every case, to avoid ever being identified, charged, or held accountable. And maybe that's the real thread running underneath this entire list. Not a single perpetrator, not a single conspiracy connecting all 10 cases, because there's no credible evidence supporting that kind of theory, and this list has been careful not to suggest one. The thread is something quieter and, in its own way, more disturbing. The fact that Minnesota, like every state, has spaces geographic, institutional, procedural, where a person can disappear, and the systems built to find them can fail, repeatedly, in ways that compound the original tragedy. A delayed search here. An incomplete search there. A theory pursued for years that turns out to be wrong. A piece of evidence destroyed before it could be examined. None of these failures, on their own, explain any single case completely. But across 10 cases, spanning more than 50 years of Minnesota history, the pattern of institutional friction becomes impossible to ignore. There's no clean way to end a list like this. 9 of these 10 families are still waiting for the kind of phone call the Wetterlings finally got in 2016. The kind that doesn't undo the loss, but at least replaces the not knowing with something solid to stand on. For Brandon's parents, for Josh's father, for Susan's mother, for Lloyd's daughter, for Jody's family, for whoever still remembers Belinda Vanlith, for Rita Recker's memory, for Haley's family still working through the half answer they finally received, for whoever is still searching the highway between Champlin and Wisconsin for any trace of Georgia Smith, the map stays open. The pins stay in place. None of them get to put this down. Not really, not until an answer arrives, if one ever does. The map doesn't tell you where they went. It only shows you where they were last. There's something worth sitting with before this list closes out completely. And it has to do with what these cases ask of the people who live in the places where they happened. Every one of these 10 locations is still standing. Every gas station, every campus path, every lakeshore, every highway corridor, none of it has been roped off. None of it has been turned into a memorial. None of it carries any visible marker of what happened there. People drive past the Lake Elmo intersection every day without knowing. Students at St. John's walk past Stumpf Lake without any sense of what that bridge means to one family. The Angleworm Lake Trail still gets hiked every summer by people who have no idea that a stretch of it once held the last physical trace of a man who never came home. That's the unsettling truth underneath a list like this one. The places don't remember. Only the people do, the families, the investigators who carried these files for decades, the communities that absorbed the loss and kept living anyway, because that's what communities do. Minnesota doesn't pause for its missing. It keeps planting crops in the Southwest, keeps running its university campuses behind the pine curtain, keeps letting families drive out to Wisconsin lake cabins every July. The state moves forward, the cases don't. Consider, for a moment, what it actually means for a case to stay open for decades. It's not simply a file sitting in a drawer somewhere, untouched. Active cold cases get periodic review. Investigators revisit old evidence with new forensic technology as it becomes available. DNA techniques that didn't exist in 1974 or 1988 or even 2002 are sometimes applied, retroactively to old evidence, occasionally producing breakthroughs decades after the fact. Genetic genealogy, the same technique that has cracked open cold cases across the country in recent years by matching crime scene DNA to distant relatives through consumer genealogy databases, represents one of the more promising tools available to investigators working cases like the ones on this list. Whether it will ever be applied successfully to any of these 9 remaining open cases is unknown. But the tool exists now in a way it simply didn't when most of these disappearances first happened. That's part of what makes a case like Jacob Wetterling's both an answer and a warning. It proves that resolution is possible, even after 27 years, even when every conventional investigative avenue had been exhausted. But it also proves that resolution, when it finally comes, can arrive almost by accident, not because investigators finally cracked the case through persistence and skill, but because the person responsible happened to get caught for something else and made a calculated decision to talk. That's a fragile, uncomfortable kind of hope to hold on to for the families of the other 9. It means an answer is possible. It also means an answer might depend entirely on circumstances no one can control or predict. There's a reason cases like these continue to draw attention decades after the fact, beyond simple curiosity or fascination with the unknown. Public attention does, occasionally, produce results. Tip lines stay active because tips occasionally come in, even after 30 or 40 or 50 years. The Netflix feature on Joshua Guimond's case generated renewed leads in 2022. The Hulu documentary on Jody Huisentruit's disappearance contributed to a search in Winsted in 2024. Dateline's coverage of Susan Sweetel's case in 2024 kept her story in front of a national audience nearly 4 decades after she vanished. Every time one of these cases gets told again, somewhere, someone who has been holding onto a piece of information maybe for years, maybe out of fear, maybe simply because they never thought it mattered, has another chance to come forward. That's worth remembering as this list comes to a close. These aren't just stories, they're active investigations. Every one of them except Jacob Wetterling's, still technically open, still technically searching for whatever piece of information might finally break them loose. Crime Stoppers of Minnesota maintains tip lines for cases like Belinda Van Lith's and Georgia Smith's. The Washington County Sheriff's Office still offers a reward for information on Susan Sweetel. The Stearns County Sheriff's Office still actively pursues leads on Joshua Guimond more than 2 decades later. None of these cases have been quietly shelved. They're sitting, waiting, the same way they've been waiting for years, sometimes for decades, for the one piece of information that finally connects everything. What does it mean, in the end, to live in a state with this many unanswered questions sitting just beneath the surface of ordinary life? It means the comfort of routine, the gas station you stop at, the trail you hike, the highway you drive every summer, exists alongside the knowledge that, for at least 9 families, that exact same ordinary routine was the last thing standing between their loved one and a question that has never been answered. It doesn't mean any of these places are more dangerous than anywhere else in the country. Disappearances like these happen everywhere, in every state, on every kind of road and trail and parking lot in America. Minnesota isn't unique in that sense. What's unique, if anything, is simply that these 10 cases happen to land in the same state, the same geography, woven together by years and counties and, in some cases, by people who knew each other or who crossed paths in ways that feel almost too coincidental to be coincidence. Jody Huisentruit interviewing Patty Wetterling years before her own disappearance, Robert Dudley's research touching both the Recker case and the Wetterling case, Stearns County appearing again and again across decades of unsolved Minnesota history. These threads don't prove a conspiracy. They don't prove a single perpetrator moving unnoticed across decades. What they prove, if anything, is how small this state really is beneath its size on a map. How the same names, the same counties, the same investigators, the same researchers keep showing up across cases separated by years and sometimes decades. Because Minnesota's population, despite its size, is concentrated enough, connected enough, that these threads were always going to cross eventually. There's also something to be said about what these families carry, individually, beneath the broader patterns and statistics. Brian Swanson left a porch light burning every night for 5 years, a small, stubborn act of hope against overwhelming odds. Brian Guimond has sat, by his own account, in the same chair for over 20 years, waiting for a phone call that still hasn't come. Rita Reeker spent the rest of her life as an advocate, turning grief into action the same way Patty Wetterling did. The same way so many families of the missing eventually find themselves doing, not because it heals anything, but because doing nothing feels unbearable. These aren't abstractions. They're specific people who built specific routines around an absence that never resolved, who learned to live inside a permanent question mark, because the alternative, giving up entirely, was never something they were willing to do. It's worth pausing, too, on what these cases ask of the rest of us. The people watching, the people who weren't there, who have no direct connection to any of these 10 names beyond the fact that we now know their stories. There's a temptation, with cases like these, to treat them purely as entertainment puzzles to be solved, mysteries to be picked apart for their most chilling details. That temptation isn't wrong, exactly. Curiosity is part of how these cases stay in the public consciousness long enough to occasionally produce a breakthrough. But it's worth remembering, underneath the dread and the contradictions and the unanswered questions, that every name on this list belonged to an actual person, with an actual family, who is still, right now, living with an absence that the rest of us only get to visit for the length of a video. Minnesota's Bureau of Criminal Apprehension maintains an official clearinghouse of missing persons cases, a public-facing database where anyone can search active cases, submit tips, and review the details investigators have made available. Cases like the ones in this list represent only a fraction of the total cold cases sitting in that database. Minnesota, like every state, carries hundreds of unresolved missing persons files, most of which will never receive the kind of national attention that cases like Jacob Wetterling's or Jody Huisentruitt's have generated. The 10 cases featured here were selected because of the volume of public reporting available, because of the specific, documented details that allow a case to be told responsibly and accurately. But they represent the visible surface of a much larger, much quieter problem families across the state, right now, holding on to the same kind of unresolved grief, without the benefit of a documentary, without a Dateline segment, without the attention that, sometimes, eventually, produces an answer. That asymmetry is worth acknowledging honestly. Attention matters in these cases. It generates tips. It keeps pressure on agencies to continue allocating resources to decades-old files. It occasionally, as in Joshua Guimon's case or Jody Huisentruitt's case, produces new leads decades after the initial investigation went cold. But attention is also unevenly distributed, shaped by factors that have nothing to do with how deserving a case is of resolution media markets. The photogenic nature of a victim's life story, whether a true crime podcast or documentary producer happens to pick up the thread. The cases that get told and retold are not necessarily the cases most likely to be solved. They're simply the cases that have, for whatever reason, captured enough public interest to stay visible. What this list ultimately offers isn't closure, it can't. Not for 9 of these 10 families, not with the information currently available. What it offers is visibility. A reminder that these cases are still open, still searching, still waiting for the one detail that might finally break decades of silence. If anyone watching has information about Brandon Swanson's last walk through the dark, about what happened on the bridge near Stumpf Lake, about the man in the Ford LTD outside that Lake Elmo gas station, about anyone who may have crossed paths with Lloyd Skelton on the Angleworm Trail, about the white van in that Mason City parking lot, about who had access to that property on Little Eagle Lake, about anyone connected to the Wrecker family's route to the Zayre store, about Haley Amar's life in the weeks before December of 2015, about any sighting of Georgia Smith on her drive toward Wisconsin. Every one of these cases has an active tip line, and every one of these families is still listening, still hoping, after all these years, that someone watching tonight is the one who finally knows something worth saying out loud. Go back to that map one final time. Minnesota, 10,000 lakes. Forests so thick the GPS stops working. Towns so quiet the neighbors all wave. That's where this started. That's the image that opened this entire list, and it's worth returning to now, because everything you've heard since then has happened inside that exact same picture. The same lakes, the same forests, the same quiet towns where everyone waves, where everyone assumes the person walking past them on the sidewalk is safe, is known, is simply a neighbor going about an ordinary day. You pulled up a map at the start of this. Here's what it looks like now. 10 names, 10 locations, scattered across a state that looks, on paper, like one of the safest places in the country to live. Low crime rates, friendly people, the kind of place outsiders associate with hot dish and politeness, and winters cold enough to keep most trouble from finding a reason to start. And yet, somewhere underneath that reputation, these 10 people walked out their doors, got in their cars, took a familiar route, trusted a familiar place, and never came back. A farm road in southwest Minnesota, where a porch light burned for 5 years waiting for a son who never walked back into it. A university campus, 2,500 acres deep in pine forest, where a 3-minute walk between 2 dormitories became the last 3 minutes of a young man's known life. A gas station 1 mile from home, where a tampered radiator in a stranger's car turned a routine drive into the last anyone would ever see of a 19-year-old girl. A wilderness trail circling a remote lake, where an experienced outdoorsman's clothing was found scattered along a path that swallowed him whole and never gave him back. A parking lot, 30 seconds from an apartment door, where a morning news anchor lost a fight for her car keys in the dark hours before dawn, and where the truth has stayed locked away for 30 years. A lakeshore in Wright County, quiet and isolated, where a young woman house-sitting alone simply wasn't there anymore by the time anyone came to check. A street in St. Cloud, leading toward a discount store a single mile away, where 2 sisters left on a holiday afternoon and were found, 26 days later, in a quarry that had no business being part of their story. A suburban wetland in New Brighton, where a skull surfaced after 9 years in the mud and gave one family an answer to where, while leaving the question of why and how completely unresolved. A highway corridor running toward a Wisconsin lake cabin, where a 76-year-old grandmother vanished so completely that not even her car was ever found. And a rural road in Stearns County, where a masked man in October of 1989 changed the trajectory of an entire family's life, and where, 27 years later, a farm finally gave up the answer everyone had been waiting for. 9 of these cases remain exactly where they were when this list began. Open, unresolved, waiting. The 10th Jacob Wetterlings closed, but only after nearly 3 decades, and only through circumstances that had little to do with traditional investigative triumph. That's the most honest thing that can be said about closure in cases like these. It happens rarely, it happens late, and when it happens, it rarely happens the way anyone expected it to. The map doesn't tell you where they went, it just shows you where they were last. That's the unsettling truth sitting at the center of every single one of these 10 stories. A map can show you a gas station, a campus path, a trailhead, a parking lot, a lakeshore, a quarry, a wetland, a highway, a rural road. It can show you the last confirmed point where each of these people existed in the world, as everyone knew them. What it cannot show you what 9 of these 10 cases have never been able to show anyone, despite decades of searching, despite cadaver dogs and dive teams and National Guard deployments, and federal grand juries and genetic genealogy, and true crime documentaries and persistent advocates who refuse to stop asking questions, is what happened after that. Last point on the map. Where the trail actually goes once it stops being visible. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a case once the search has been exhausted, once every lead has been chased down and every theory examined and every piece of available evidence reviewed for the 100th time. It's not the quiet of resolution. It's the quiet of a file sitting open, technically active, technically still being worked, but functionally waiting for a tip that may never come, for a piece of forensic technology that doesn't exist yet, for someone, somewhere, to finally decide that whatever they've been holding on to for years or decades is worth saying out loud. That's where this list leaves you. Not with answers, not with the kind of tidy resolution that true crime stories sometimes promise and rarely deliver. Just with 10 names, 10 places, and the recognition that somewhere out there, in the quiet towns and flat farmland and dense pine forests of Minnesota, the doors on these cases are still open, not closed, not abandoned, just open, the way a door stays open when you're still expecting someone to walk back through it. For 9 of these families, that door has been open for years, For some, decades. They've learned to live around the opening, to function, to work, to celebrate birthdays and holidays and the ordinary passage of time, all while that door stays open in the background, never quite letting them set it aside completely. That's not a metaphor for closure. It's the opposite. It's what it actually looks like to live with an unanswered disappearance in your family for years on end. Not a dramatic, constant grief, but a quiet, persistent awareness that something is still missing, that the story isn't finished, that somewhere out there is an answer nobody has found yet. If any of these cases connect to something you know, a detail, a name, a memory that's been sitting unexamined for years, every one of them has an active tip line, still listening, still waiting, the same way these families have been waiting all along. There's a question worth asking, now that all 10 cases have been laid out side by side. What does it actually take for a case like one of these to finally close? Looking back across the list, the pattern isn't encouraging, but it isn't entirely without hope either. Jacob Wetterling's case took 27 years and ultimately depended on a confession secured through circumstances unrelated to the original crime. That's the one example of resolution in this entire list, and even it came with caveats: 6 years of delay after a name first surfaced. A resolution achieved through a plea deal rather than a direct investigative breakthrough. Lingering questions about whether the person responsible acted entirely alone. For the other 9, what would resolution actually require? In some cases, Brandon Swanson's, Lloyd Skelton's, it might require nothing more than a body finally surfacing, decades after a wilderness or a waterway gave up trying to hide it. Rivers run dry during droughts. Forests get cleared for development. Wetlands get drained for construction projects. Time has a way of eventually revealing what it once concealed, the way it did for Haley Amar's family in 2025. After 9 years of searching produced nothing, and then, suddenly, produced everything that remained. In other cases, Susan Sweetle's, Jody Huey-Centrut's, the Reeker sisters' resolution would likely require something closer to what finally happened with Jacob Wetterling, a person, somewhere, deciding to talk. Whether out of guilt, or fear of being caught for something else, or simple old age and the desire to unburden themselves before death. Cold cases involving foul play often depend less on forensic breakthrough and more on human conscience, however long that conscience takes to surface. It's an uncomfortable thing to acknowledge, but it's also, in a strange way, a source of genuine hope. The people responsible for these crimes, if they're still alive, are growing older. People who have carried secrets for decades sometimes find, late in life, that the weight becomes too much to keep carrying alone. That's part of why cases like these continue to be told and retold, year after year, decade after decade. Every retelling is, in its own small way, an invitation to the people who might know something, to come forward, to the investigators who might be assigned to revisit these files, to keep looking, to the families who are still waiting, to know that their loved one hasn't been forgotten, that their case hasn't quietly faded into the background noise of Minnesota history. Consider what's actually changed since some of these cases began. Brandon Swanson disappeared in 2008, in an era when cell phone tower triangulation was still a relatively new investigative tool, and even then, it only told investigators where his phone had been, not where he went after the call ended. Susan Sweetle disappeared in 1988, decades before DNA databases or genetic genealogy existed in any usable form. The Reeker sisters disappeared in 1974, in an investigative landscape that looks almost unrecognizable compared to what's available to law enforcement today. Each passing year brings new forensic tools, new technology, new possibilities for revisiting evidence that seemed exhausted decades ago. The fact that none of these tools have yet produced a breakthrough in 9 of these 10 cases isn't necessarily evidence that none of them ever will. It's evidence that some questions take longer to answer than anyone wants them to. What this list leaves behind, more than anything, is a kind of attentiveness, an awareness that the ordinary places woven through daily Minnesota life carry, in at least 10 documented instances, the weight of an ending nobody got to see, an ending that's still, technically, unwritten. The next time you pass a gas station on a snowy night, or walk a wooded trail near a quiet lake, or drive a familiar highway toward a family cabin, There's no reason for fear. These places are, overwhelmingly, exactly as safe as they appear to be, for the millions of people who pass through them every single day without incident. But there's also no reason to forget that, for at least 10 people across the span of more than 50 years, that ordinary safety simply didn't hold, for reasons nobody has ever been able to fully explain, and for 9 families who are still, tonight, waiting for a phone to ring with the answer they've spent decades hoping to hear. 10,000 lakes, 10,000 quiet towns, and somewhere among them, 9 doors that are still standing open.